It's so easy to get captivated by this vision of electric flying vehicles zipping across our cities. But while we're all looking up at the sky, the real revolution, and honestly, the real challenge, is happening right here on the ground. Because think about it. Without a place to land, to charge, to take off, these incredible aircraft are basically just cool-looking museum pieces. So today, we're going to dig into the anatomy of the vertiport, the critical, super complex, and often overlooked foundation of our flying future.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to define what a vertiport actually is and why it's so much more than a helipad. Then, we'll get into the nitty-gritty geometry that safety demands. After that, we'll uncover an invisible hazard called downwash. Next up, we'll tackle the massive energy problem, what I call the megawatt power cord issue. We'll also dive into the human side of things, noise and community buy-in. And finally, we'll look at the ground game ahead.
For years, all the hype, all the attention has been on the eVTOLs themselves. I mean, for good reason, right? They're incredible machines. But the whole industry is now staring down a classic chicken and egg problem. You can't get these new aircraft certified without places to operate them, but who's going to build all that expensive infrastructure until the aircraft are certified? So this ground game, it's become the real bottleneck holding back the entire dream of advanced air mobility. Okay, so let's make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Here's the official definition from the FAA. A vertiport is an area designed specifically to support powered lift aircraft. Now that phrase is so important. It's not just a generic term for helicopters. It refers to this whole new class of vehicle, and that single distinction changes absolutely everything.
Which, of course, brings up the number one question I get. Isn't this just a glorified helipad with a cooler name? Well, as we're about to see, the answer is a hard no. The engineering, the safety protocols, the sheer energy requirements for a vertiport, they go way beyond anything a traditional heliport was ever built to handle.
And to really understand why, we've got to look at the actual blueprint for these facilities. The design rules are all laid out in this super important document from the FAA. It's called Engineering Brief 105A. This is basically the rulebook, and it gets right into the technical details of what makes a vertiport so different.
At the absolute heart of the vertiport, you have the TLOF. The easiest way to think about this is like the bullseye of a target. It's the reinforced, load-bearing part that has to take the full weight of the aircraft, both when it's just sitting there and the dynamic force of it landing. It has to be the strongest point of the whole pad.
Now, wrapped around that strong center is the FATO. This isn't optional. It's a mandatory, totally obstacle-free safety buffer. Its job is to give the aircraft a protected, clear space during those really critical moments, the final approach, and the very beginning of takeoff. It's the built-in margin for error. And this is where it gets really interesting, how these areas are sized. It is not arbitrary at all. The TLOF has to be at least as wide as the aircraft's rotor diameter. Then the FATO has to be twice that. And the total safety area around it all, 2.5 times the aircraft's biggest dimension. These strict formulas are non-negotiable, and they have huge real-world impacts. They basically dictate that only the biggest, most structurally sound rooftops in a city even have a shot at becoming a vertiport. But the challenges aren't just about the concrete and steel you can see. A vertiport also has to manage this powerful, invisible force that these new aircraft generate, and that's downwash. And believe me, it is a whole lot more than just a stiff breeze.
So imagine this. The multiple rotors on an eVTOL are pushing this massive column of air straight down. When that blast of air hits the solid ground of the vertiport, it has nowhere to go but sideways. That creates this powerful horizontal wind called outwash. And in a city, squeezed between buildings, that outwash can slam into a wall and create a dangerous swirling vortex that affects not just the aircraft, but everything and everyone nearby.
And to give you a sense of the power we're talking about, the FAA warns that this outwash can easily top 34.5 miles per hour. I mean, that is more than enough to knock a person off their feet or turn a piece of equipment that isn't tied down into a dangerous projectile. To handle this, vertiports have to create what's called a downwash caution area, which is basically a restricted zone where people can't go during takeoffs and landings. Okay, so we've engineered the pad, we've managed the wind, but now we come to what might just be the biggest hurdle of them all. How do you power these things? If a vertiport is the airport of the future, it also has to be the gas station of the future. And these aircraft are incredibly thirsty for electricity.
So how thirsty are we talking? Well, studies from places like the National Renewable Energy Lab and McKinsey estimate that a busy vertiport, one that's charging multiple aircraft at once for quick turnarounds, is going to need a power draw of over 1 megawatt. That's 1,000 kilowatts.
To put that number in perspective, pulling 1 megawatt is like flipping the switch on every single light in a professional football stadium, just to service a handful of aircraft. Most city power grids are just not built to handle that kind of intense localized demand. It often means multi-million-dollar upgrades to substations and transformers, costs that can easily be way more than the price of the landing pad itself.
So what this means is we need completely new kinds of hardware. Companies are already developing solutions, things like these mobile charging cubes and permanent heavy-duty DC fast-charging stations. These systems are being designed from the ground up to deliver that massive amount of power safely and quickly, right there at the pad.
And of course, anytime you have that much electricity in one place, you have a serious risk of fire. Lithium-ion battery fires are notoriously hard to put out, and they can lead to this dangerous chain reaction called thermal runaway. A fire in one aircraft's battery could literally spread to the next one or even to the building. This has forced the creation of a whole new playbook for fire safety, like standards NFPA 418 and 855, which require specialized containment and fire suppression systems built just for these high-energy batteries. Okay, let's move on to what might be the most complicated challenge of all. And that's because it's not about engineering or electricity, it's about people. The success of vertiports is going to depend 100% on whether the communities living and working around them actually want them there.
There's this really weird paradox with eVTOL noise. You hear all these claims about how quiet they are, but that's usually talking about when they're cruising hundreds of feet up in the air. The reality on the ground, where they're taking off and landing right next to you, that's a very different and much louder story.
And this isn't just a guess. Research from Bristol University confirms it. They've pinpointed this aerodynamic thing called ground effect. Basically, the air getting pushed down by the rotors smacks into the ground and reflects back up, creating these complex forces that make the aircraft significantly louder during those low-altitude maneuvers. And, it's not just about the decibel level. The science of psychoacoustics tells us that the type of sound is just as important. That high-frequency whine from the electric motors and the fast-spinning props of an eVTOL can be way more annoying to our ears than the low-frequency thumping of a helicopter, even if they're technically at the same volume. And at the end of the day, this all comes down to the biggest roadblock of all, public acceptance. As this quote says so perfectly, if a community decides the noise is too much or that this new service only benefits the wealthy, they have all the power to stop it. Through local zoning boards and permit hearings, the public on the ground will get the final vote on whether a vertiport ever gets built. So after navigating all of these challenges, the geometry, the wind, the power grid, public opinion, what does the path forward actually look like? Well, the next 2 years are absolutely critical. We're all waiting for the FAA to release its final standards for vertiports, probably in late 2025. And that is going to kick off this mad dash, this infrastructure readiness phase, as cities and companies race to figure out the zoning, upgrade the power grids, and actually start pouring concrete. And this is all happening while the first full-scale aircraft are supposed to start their own flight tests. And that really brings us to the final crucial question. The aircraft. The flying cars that we've been dreaming about for decades. They are so close to being here. The technology in the air is on the verge of becoming a reality. But the ground game, the game of concrete, zoning, power, and public trust, is really just getting started. And whether our cities are truly ready for their arrival, well, that remains to be seen.